Alrighty, let's get started. Welcome to another Healthy Gamer GG stream. My name is Alok Kanoja. Just a reminder that although I am a psychiatrist, nothing we discuss on stream today is intended to be taken as medical advice. Everything we're going to be talking about today is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Welcome, everyone. Happy Wednesday. So we have a super awesome thing that we're doing today on stream. So recently there was a docuseries about psychedelics that was based on a book that Michael Pollan wrote called How to Change Your Mind. And the docuseries was on Netflix. And so today what we're actually going to be talking about is psychedelics. And we're going to have Dr. Will Su joining us. So Will is an expert on psychedelics. He's also a psychiatrist out in California. We trained at the same institution, Mass General Hospital, McLean Hospital, and Harvard Medical School. So I got to know Will a little bit there. And it's been really awesome because he's sort of emerged kind of as an expert in the field of psychedelics, and he's been nice enough to come back on stream. Some of y'all may have remembered about 2 years ago, I want to say it's close to 2 years ago, we had Will come on and talk about psychedelics. I think that was very helpful and impactful for many people in our community. And so today Will and I are going to sort of be having a conversation about the docuseries, sort of what it does well, maybe what it doesn't do great, sort of discussing a lot of the points. I think there's a lot of fantastic stuff in there, a lot of really fascinating kind of questions about, the nature of life, the nature of human relationships with nature, the nature of consciousness, and how psychedelics may be able to be used for treatment, concerns around some of that stuff. So we're going to be talking about those kinds of things. I personally am going to probably the thing that I find the most interesting about psychedelics is basically what we're sort of learning about the nature of consciousness and reality potentially through psychedelics. So that may be my bias, but Will and I are just going to have a conversation about it, and hopefully it'll be useful to people who are watching. A couple of questions a couple of announcements before we kind of hop in with Will. So our Touch of Grass challenge is still going on. It's happening in the month of July. So this is a photo challenge on the HG Discord where members can submit images of themselves. You can use the /touchgrass command to submit photos and try to complete up to 100 objectives. I saw recently that someone actually went and built a real cabin in the wilderness as part of the challenge, and they're out there writing a book now. So that's fantastic. Hopefully everything is safe and comfortable for them. But I really love this challenge because I think it exemplifies what we want this community to be, which is we're going to learn about ourselves, and we're going to hang out, on the internet and stream and all that good stuff. And we're going to make jokes about gaming. But this community is really there to be a bridge and a support to building your life. And what I'm thrilled about in terms of the Touch Grass Challenge is that it's very actionable in helping people do that. Getting out, going to the beach, touching sand, picking fresh fruit, building a cabin in the woods if you want to go, hardcore, writing a book out there, which is that's fantastic. The other thing that I really love about the Touch Grass Challenge is that it really exemplifies the power of community. I say this periodically. I don't know how many people believe it, but this community, HG is not about me. And I recognize that I'm sort of a figurehead here, but it's really about y'all. So this was something that was developed by our community, organized by our community, and participated in by our community. And the positivity of it doesn't come from me. And that's the whole ethos of what we do here with AOE Healing. It's that if we get together and we put our minds to it, we can actually start to build healthy lives, and we can become healthy gamers. And half of our community isn't even gamers. So that's totally fine too. Right? Anyway, so definitely check it out. If y'all are looking for basically an excuse to get out there and do additional things, I highly, highly recommend you participate in the challenge and get away from a screen for a little while. Couple of other things. So we're hosting another Ask a Coach event in our Discord with the topic being communication and dating. So that event starts immediately after stream. So it's supposed to start at 2 p.m. Sometimes stream runs long and things like that. And maybe the event will last longer. I'm not quite sure. So we're going to do our best to really end at 2 o'clock. And for those of y'all that are interested, you can hop on Discord and, join, type. There's a command in chat for !Discord to get info on how to join our Discord. So there'll be a coach there, and then it's ask a coach around dating and relationships. So y'all can kind of hop in. I understand that people really sort of enjoy that, and it tends to be educational and entertaining and things like that. So definitely check that out. So next up, we're going to actually just hop into a call with Will. So let me just see if I can get this going. Will? There we go. Let me just make sure that... Hey, Will.
Hey, how's it going?
Good, man. How are you?
Good. Looks like you had some upgrade of your background.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Very nice decor.
Let me just make sure I can get this. I'm going to just fix... there we go. So can you just count to 10 for me, Will?
Is this a test of my mental abilities? Or
No. It's calibrating my audio input and your audio input so we're the same volume on stream.
Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5,
Perfect.
6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. I can keep going.
Yeah. So first of all, Will, thank you very much for being here. Do you want to take a moment? I did a small introduction about you, but do you want to just start by telling us a little bit about who you are and a bit about your journey?
Sure. Yeah, so my name is Will Sue. I'm a psychiatrist. I trained at the same residency in Boston at Harvard, like Dr. K. I'm also, I would consider myself a scientist. I got a PhD in immunology at Oxford before going to train as a psychiatrist. But yeah, I think a lot of people here maybe watched or listened to our last conversation, so I won't go too perhaps into the background. But I'm 42, and my journey with psychedelics started about exactly 10 years ago now. Before that, I was very against drugs. I had just been, a product of the war on drugs in the 80s. I thought they were dangerous. I thought they were addictive. I was also raised Jehovah's Witness, so I thought they were like these evil things. I'd never really taken anything consciousness altering other than, smoking pot like 3 times, which was very scary even then. So meaning I'm a pretty late bloomer to drugs. But really I went to them because I was really struggling with my mental health when I first started at my residency in Boston, struggling to the point of thoughts of suicide. So just kind of by chance at the same time, my childhood best friend got exposed to psychedelics. He kept telling me about how useful they may be and how much research had been done. But it took me like 6 months to even start reading about it. I just blew him off. And it took me about another 9 months to finally try it. But my mental health had gotten to the point where I was like, fuck it, I'm either, I may end up killing myself or I'll try this crazy drug. And that was an opening to me to just, what I would call a real healing path and giving me some, just putting me on the path. It certainly was not a fix-all the first time, not even close, but it was almost like a taste enough that I knew that there was something else out there for me. There was a different way to feel. There was a different future for me. And I would say, now the last 10 years has been in a way, with and without psychedelics, getting back to that place that I tasted that first time. And I think, and through that process, then I became an advocate, an educator. Really, my career has now, been mostly around psychedelic therapy, because it happened to be kind of right time and place where psychiatry was starting to pick up on these. So
absolutely,
that's me in a nutshell.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that background, Will. It's interesting. Even having known you for a while, I had not known how much you had personally struggled. I mean, I think in conversations we had in the past, you sort of mentioned that here or there, but It's so interesting to hear kind of your personal journey. And today we're going to be talking about this Netflix docuseries, How to Change Your Mind, which was, I think, adapted from Michael Pollan's book about psychedelics. So can you just share with me a little bit about, what your general impressions about the docuseries, like just general impressions, like what do you think about it?
Sure, sure. And I'm curious, is this just being recorded to be shared, or are some people listening right now?
Oh yeah, no, this is live, bro.
Okay. No, I just don't see it. I just see me and you, but it's probably fine.
Yeah.
That's totally fine. Yeah. So yeah, I was just curious. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the docu-series, in my initial kind of, I don't know, and this is just giving people insight into my own process. It was like I initially actually wasn't even going to watch it because, like in the last 3 years, having been in the psychedelic world or the therapy community, I would call it, for the last 10 years, a lot of us have kind of been like, what the hell happened in the last 2 to 3 years? like it used to be this small community. Everyone pretty much knew each other. Everyone, had, I feel like, more of a deep understanding of how this works. And in the last 3 years, it just exploded. And I think a big issue with that was capitalism entering in the same way capitalism has been doing its thing. So all of a sudden you have all these companies and all these people claiming to know how this works. And I think at the very least, it's irresponsible, some of what's happening. And at its worst, it's like, has the potential to misdirect people to something harmful. I think, and another thing is just like, I feel like, when people are not knowing how to work with these, but give it a shot, like, the number of emails I get from people being like, finally did ketamine treatments, I finally did this, and I feel the same. It's kind of sad for me because there's been this like excitement around
Mm.
psychedelics. And thinking, Michael Pollan, I think he did a great thing in terms of education. But then there's one particular New York Times op-ed that he wrote that I thought was very irresponsible, where he said basically psychedelics should remain in the hands of doctors. We should not make this decriminalized. And that really upset me because I'm like, he's not a healer. He has only tried psychedelics a handful of times, to his admission. So I'm like, it's irresponsible. So anyway, that was my own just personal stuff around Michael.
Sure.
But then I don't know, like last week texting with you, and I was like, I don't know. And forgiveness and feeling people can change is a big theme of psychedelics. So I'm like, okay, I had this prior thing about Michael Pollan. Let me check it out. And I was actually blown away by how well done it was. And I actually I know the executive producer behind it, Lucy. Her and I had gone to an ayahuasca retreat in Peru. I mean, I think it's the most complete, I think I would call it educational series out there. I think they covered the history very well. They covered literally just the history of the development of psychedelics. They did that better than anyone else I've ever seen. They went into the politics deeply and in a critical way, which I think was very powerful, just to really show this was not a medical reason that these were made illegal. It was very much a political reason. I think they did that very well. I think they showed. Sorry,
Sorry.
the image is going in and out.
Yeah,
Can you
sorry.
still hear
I
me?
just I can still hear you. I just had to change the server real quick because it was lagging a little bit.
Okay.
So you were saying they went into the
Okay.
politics in a critical way?
Yeah, they went into the politics very beautifully. I think they didn't shy away from being like, the government was scared and still may be scared of, what they have built being, threatened by people expanding their consciousness in a healthy way. I think they beautifully showed stories of how, people sharing how they went through the process, how difficult it was for them, meaning now the patients, things that they've overcome. That was also done more thoroughly than I've ever seen it done. Um, and yeah, I think, that's kind of my summary of it. I just think
Yeah.
they did a very, very good job.
Are there things that you think the docuseries could have done better? Are there like things that, let's say if that was my only exposure to psychedelics or first exposure to psychedelics, would there be things, just given your, years of expertise and clinical training and working with patients, would there be things that you would want to tack on that you were sure that people were kind of aware of?
the thing is, I don't know. So the quick answer to that is yes. But then I kind of think back to where, I don't know, I've become much more patient, you know, in the last 6 months, let alone the last time we talked. Meaning, you know, there are some things I would have added, but the reality is I'm like, I think, you know, things like, I'm trusting more that things like this are coming out to meet people where they are, you know, and you know, there are some things I was surprised that they went into, like they went into this piece about with the policeman that's become a psychedelic therapist, and he admits on you know how this violence towards people of color and that drugs were a part of that, and he's an active police officer. And that also, I loved how he also shared that the police are scared. You know, the police aren't just villains. Like that, I was like, whoa, like that's some really profound stuff I did not expect. And you know, I mean, that in particular, and I talked to Rick Doblin, who's a friend, who's kind of one of, you know, the reason, who they go into in episode 4, you know, and he actually said that the executive director of this, you know, this mutual friend of ours, Lucy, had to fight Netflix in order to keep that in. Like Netflix was like, whoa, this is like too controversial, but she's like, no, this needs to be in. So
Wow.
I'll say that, yeah, I'll start by saying there was actually stuff in there that I didn't even expect to be in there. I was like, this is when I'm like, wow, it was really well done. I think the thing that, huh?
Yeah, just to offer
Go
a
ahead,
bit of
sorry.
context for people who haven't seen the series, I think in episode 3 there's a really awesome segment by like Will said, a police officer, and the head of the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Research, Rick Doblin, and this police officer actually go to a conference for, I think, police chiefs. So it's like the annual National Police Chief Conference, and they actually do a presentation about the use of psychedelics. And because the truth of the matter is that policing can be quite a traumatic experience. And you know, I don't know how much you worked with like some of the first responder programs at McLean. I did a bunch of work over there, but working with firemen, policemen, veterans, that there's just so much trauma, fear. You know, it's a very hard job to have. And so it was really eye-opening to see that they were open enough to have this kind of presentation at their annual conference, and that one of their own, who had been in policing for 10 years and is now training to be a MAPS, he's in MAPS training to become a psychedelic therapist, just how open they were to that idea. So what really shocked me about that was actually like how non-antagonistic that was. Right. It's kind of showing.
I mean, they presented something significant, but they were like, you know, it's almost like, yeah, people in some ways, whether it's overtly sharing or non-overtly sharing, people are feeling like things are not like things are broken right now, and we at least need to start considering new things. And yeah, because, and the other thing, you know, to make what you were saying a bit more poignant, is that what I think psychedelics have the potential to do, they've already done, but we can do more, is this us versus them. They are the problem. If we get rid of that, we're okay. You know, and that's that. I mean, that's in politics. That's like Republicans versus Democrats. You know, police versus minorities, or the Black Lives Matter. It's like, but this is, I'm not saying there's like both sides are doing this. There's always an us versus them. And I think that is one area that, if one really follows the storyline, I think that's where Rick Doblin in episode 3, I loved also that that was the most complete background of him that they've ever given. And again, this guy, you know, who, you know, you just mentioned, is like someone who he was the first person I met, and happened to be like, it was only because he was like, he lived 2 blocks from the hospital from where Dr. K and I were working. And like, I was like, it like blew my mind. It's many times where I'm like, how, like the circumstances and the choices that I had to make to have that be the first person I met. He was a mentor to me now. And like now, like, you know, I rarely text him these days, even though he always gets back to me, because I'm like, this guy's so busy. But I'm like, how the heck did I end up meeting this guy?
Yeah,
you know?
we were.
Anyway, I you know, the reason I brought him up is just because, you know, they go into how this is basically his planet. He committed to himself to become making MDMA a medicine at the age of 18. So 50 years ago, and started MAPS 36 years ago. So he, you know, when I think of him, he is like the most masterful person at relationships that I have ever met. Like
Interesting.
works with people. He does not judge people. He does not other people. He does not build these us versus them. Because I don't think, if you think about what he did would not be possible if he fell into these things. You know what I mean? So he has just been working nonstop since 1986, basically bridging these gaps. And I told him, we worked on an interview a couple months ago for a project. And I'm like, he's essentially embodied what psychedelics are, but he does it in the day-to-day without the psychedelics. He's always just bridging and just working with people. And I think that, what we're seeing as a result of his embodiment of the ethos behind psychedelics.
Absolutely. We were lucky enough to have Rick on stream maybe
Oh, that's right.
maybe about a year after you came on. And what I was really surprised by is I was expecting more of a scientific, here's what psychedelics are. But dude, he was telling us stories about when he was in college and the entire campus with their professor were under the influence and outside and naked and all this weird, bizarre stuff. And it's so amazing to hear him sort of share that personal. I just remember something about the story being quite bizarre and extreme, but it's just how professional he is. I think you did a really, really good job of sort of sharing how he does a really good job at building bridges, and how a lot of, I think, what we see in the world today is as you mentioned, about us versus them. So let me ask you. So there are a couple of things, Will, that I actually took. I thought was a little bit. I have a couple of criticisms that I was hoping I could share with you about the docuseries and just kind of get your thoughts on it. So the docuseries emphasizes that. Actually, doesn't emphasize. They actually just mention it slightly. That psychedelics should be, not even should, but that proper setting is important. And they kind of talk a little bit, especially towards the end, about, the tradition usually has an elder, someone who's more experienced and things like that. But I think one thing that the docuseries made no mention of, which I've certainly seen clinically, I don't know if you've had experience with this, is that sometimes psychedelics can actually have profound negative experience on people's lives. I know that the trials don't really talk too much about that, but I've certainly worked with people who will have bad trips and will develop lasting, diagnosable psychiatric illness that can really be tracked to a particular trip. I've seen PTSD. I've seen the development of things like generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, things like that. And based on my interactions with these patients, we can sort of say, yeah, everything was fine until you had this kind of bad trip.
That last part I'm going to challenge you on.
Okay.
Because everything was fine up until then. I don't. Well, because I'm very literal when it comes to words, because I think words are crucial. So I would say that I actually, unless it's rare circumstances, and it's not the cases that you're talking about, that psychedelics could end causing something that wasn't already there by nature. I do think it's possible, but it's rare. If we think about the definition of psychedelics, that's my favorite, which I think is the most accurate, is that they are non-specific amplifiers of the unconscious, meaning they are giving us access to emotions and memories that we have put into the unconscious. So the majority of the time when people are talking about bad trips, they are talking about something was unmasked that had been already suppressed or depressed. So meaning, I don't think if what we're saying is they bring up then things after that were not because of the setting and set, we could get into a lot of detail about that also, is that I would say they are unmasking things. People either took them by themselves or they took them with practitioners that thought they could handle anything that comes up. And it wasn't sort of unfolded completely. And then it remained now at the surface where it used to be hidden. So I would say that it unmasks things that were already there almost the entire time. So that to me is most of bad trips, because if you think about what we do with psychiatric medications is we suppress, right? We use antidepressants, anti-anxiety, we suppress, we suppress, we suppress. So I think most of the time when you're saying, or, when I hear what you're saying about this, everything was fine, I would actually, I would really think about, were they really fine, or were they?
Yeah, can I just take a moment to respond to that?
Of course.
I actually kind of agree with you. I really appreciate you tunneling down into that language. So let me just explain. So I tend to agree with you that in the cases of people who used psychedelics and had bad experiences, I do not think everything was fine. So these are people that were usually, something in their life wasn't going really well. They were troubled in some way. Sometimes, in some cases, their life was actually going like quite poorly. And this is actually part of what I thought was actually really almost like, I don't know if you could call it dangerous or irresponsible, but just there was a lack of discussion about this. Is that, so if we're talking about people who have unmasked serious stuff going on, and that I'm with you that psychedelics are kind of a amplifier of the unconscious. The challenge is that the documentary kind of presents things as this is the miracle treatment for people for whom nothing else works. And so interestingly enough, what I can see happening is like there's this person who's had crippling OCD, right? And then they use psychedelics and then their OCD is cured. And what I'm kind of afraid of is that when I've seen people who have bad trips, and by the way, when I say everything was fine, what I mean by that is, first of all, that's oftentimes the language that the patient themselves will use. And secondly, prior to the psychedelic experience, they did not meet clinical criteria for a mental illness. And after the psychedelic experience, they persistently meet criteria. And I recognize there are all kinds of problems with that sort of thing. I generally speaking agree with what you're saying. But what really kind of concerns me is that people who watch this documentary who are in a very, very bad place, maybe have a lot of stuff subconsciously going on, will hear these miracle stories, will start to use psychedelics, and then will actually unmask or amplify all of the stuff that's down there, and sometimes that can end quite poorly. What do you think about that?
But and so this is actually going to be going back to my original, I didn't respond to fully to your original question of, is there something else they could have added, which is these things that we're talking about. But my response to that is going to be, yes, they could have shown more. That's why when I talk in the beginning, and when I always share about, I make a very good point to say my first psychedelic experience gave me a taste of something that was possible. And the last 10 years has been working back towards that, or maybe I'm past that now. But I always emphasize that this has been a long journey, and I have no doubt. Like, I don't know, I was speaking to a colleague of mine, Dr. Gabor Mate, who's a 78-year-old amazing doctor. He told me something that I would bring up, I think is true for me, where he's like, Will, he's like, I thank God for neuroplasticity and healing, because I would not have wanted to be as young as stupid as I was when I was 77. Okay, so meaning this growth journey will continue, and it will continue, and it will continue. So is there messaging out there that presents things as a silver bullet? Sure. But if that, this is where I'm building now bridges and gentleness, because the reality is, if we only had responsible messaging out there, we wouldn't be in the mess that we're in right now to begin with, right? And you're someone who I think we share a lot of views, and I respect you a lot, but this is why the language is important, because if you understand this stuff that we're talking about, I think at a much deeper level than the majority of people, but you're saying it unmasked something or they gave them a diagnosis they didn't have, and that, you know what I mean? Like, this is part of the messaging. That's why I think we've got to be incredibly careful. Do I think you may even understand this better than Michael Pollan? You do, but it's like, if people just took what you just said literally, and I didn't point that out, then your listeners might be like, oh, well, that can happen. So this is, and I'm not criticizing you at all. I'm just saying, this is where we all have to be more careful just with the messaging. And just the last thing I want to say is that's where I'm like, this evolution of understanding these medicines, but not really just these medicines. What we're actually going to try to understand is the human experience of pain, the human experience of healing. Those are really much more important than psychedelics. I just think psychedelics are going to be the tool that's going to allow us to do that. Now, the last thing I'll say is that Rick Doblin, who again really has been the visionary, he has said in recent interviews, he thinks that perhaps by 2070, society will have learned how to use psychedelics. And I believe that is an accurate prediction-ish, give or take 5 years. But, listening to him, knowing what he's saying, and he's also saying this is going to happen after he's dead. He knows that. And yet he's still working towards that. To me, again, this is just like, I always have lots of things I say about Rick, because it's going to take a lot of time for us to learn how to use these tools. And again, like, the messaging isn't there right now because the people don't understand that. And the last thing I want to say is that when you said teachers, guides, elders, that is true. But we don't even, like, that's the thing. Like, in terms of like true psychedelic masters that I know how to do this really well, I can count them. They just don't exist right now. And there's going to need to be a teaching and experiential part that's just going to take a long time.
So, Will, let me ask you. So, first of all, I appreciate everything you said, and especially with the nuance on language. I think that's why I actually love conversation, right? So that's where, if we're talking about nuanced language, there's messaging, right, where there's one speaker and there's one interpreter. But what I love about conversation is that we can get closer together as we kind of point out, okay, this isn't exactly what I meant, or this is where, I take an issue with what you said. So I really appreciate that perspective. I'm kind of curious, let's say, so this was something else that kind of concerned me. So I would say I'm cautiously optimistic about psychedelics. I think really sort of being grounded in research and things like that. I haven't had really much personal experience at all. We can talk about that a little bit down the road, but and I also haven't seen it used in a treatment setting. So this is where my primary experience with it has been as a clinician. And then furthermore, there's been a heavy selection bias because the people who are transformed and healed by it are not usually the ones that end up in my office. Now, over the past couple of years, actually, that's changed.
Exactly.
So there's a selection bias, I think, that I sort of see, in a sense, the worst parts of it. I do think that the docuseries, I think the docuseries actually adopts sort of, and that was one of my concerns about it, was kind of the opposite, right? They don't ever interview someone who had a crippling mental illness, tried psychedelics, and then things got worse. They're only sort of showing things. But what I'm really kind of curious about is, let's say that things get decriminalized. Let's say, can I keep going, or did you want to respond to that?
No, I was clearing my throat.
Okay. Yeah. So let's say that things get decriminalized. Let's say that, if we look at parts of California, for example, they're like, as I understand the current legal framework, is that like you can grow whatever you want to in your own garden as long as it's not commercialized or things like that. And so now as we increase access, and one of the things that you're a proponent of is that this should not necessarily be medicalized, that this is like a spiritual tradition that human beings have had access to. It's not just a medical treatment. There's almost like a medical appropriation going on. And that's something that I've even seen in the field of like yoga and meditation. But so as we increase access, let's say, and then there's this emphasis on elders, guidance, and as you said, there's only like 5 of these people out there that even how do we?
I know, yeah. I mean, there may be more.
But but I mean, like, so you're like as you mentioned, it's a small.
But yeah,
community.
No, but I am. I know I know a lot of people. Yeah,
right. So I mean, so I have a book by Gabor Mate on my shelf. Rick Doblin is an expert. Like, I think my concern, and I'm curious, like, how do we balance? So access and anyone can use it. It's for anyone versus the proper guidance, right? So how do you sort of like? I'm going to use the term enforce, but I wish there was a better term. Like, because, if it's freely available and people are like, hearing these stories about how it transformed things and stuff like that, and I can grow it myself. I'm 23 years old. How do you kind of balance responsible use versus like freedom of access? Because my concern is that as it becomes more freely available, what human beings are going to do is like not necessarily use it responsibly.
So something that Rick, again, and I always get a little shy when I say Rick because I feel like I'm talking about him all day. But he's been such a close mentor and teacher to me. But actually, first thing I wanted to say is this thing about teacher, guide, elder. Hopefully, hey, again, I think there are some people all those people that I would say are like hands down masterful healers, all have one thing in common. They have done a ton of work on themselves, meaning they have focused a large percentage of their life, their adult life, to healing themselves. Number two, they've also spent a large percentage of their adult lives healing other people. And that is where it's the experience that these people have been through. Some of those are licensed. Actually, less than half of those people who I am are masters even have a college degree. They have done profound work on the human experience themselves. And that's something, and I bring that up because that is the thing that we're lacking in the Western world, and if people look back to other cultures, all cultures, especially for men, like indigenous cultures, even American Indians, this isn't like, we're not talking thousands of years ago, had rites of passage. There's something about like walking through the fire, facing death. Like death is something we do not touch in the Western world. We skate around it. It doesn't, and I think that is why we lack elders and real people who are like, again, understanding of the nuances of life, because when you have to go through an experience like that, or experiences to, again, go from boyhood to manhood, this is where you're not going to get so lost in the dualities, like, oh, like Republicans and like you know what I mean, like it's like there's like you kind of see the boyishness, and I'm not saying boyishness in a very, I want to actually say more about that because you and I have texted about how much I appreciate your particular audience. I think it's a very special audience that I think I'll say more about, and it's an important audience in the world right now, is that there's these rites of passage, first of all, that boys have essentially lost in the Western world. And we can, the summary of it is that we literally killed it off as Christianity killed off paganism, I think, in Western Europe. And we killed off American Indians in the United States. But we can get more into that if you like. These same cultures will say that women didn't have to do that back then either, because they had childbirth. And childbirth in and of itself, without the medicalization, is a rite of passage. As you and I would both agree, as it's getting medicalized, it's shifted. But meaning there used to always be these distinctions between childhood, boyhood, or childhood, girlhood, and elders. We've lost that. And so how do we build that back into culture? I don't know. It's going to take time, right? There are elders that have popped up. I consider myself an elder at this point, but like no one,
Me too.
There wasn't like an elder book I read. I'm just like, I had to go through like some crazy ass shit. Like 95% of my psychedelic experiences were net painful. Last weekend, I did a solo experience by myself with psychedelics. I was in the fetal position, struggling my ass off the entire time. And I don't necessarily see that as bad. I see that for me as, it could have gone good and great, but for me, this is my training as like a healer. Because if I go through some crazy shit, like, most other times when I'm guiding someone, that's like, it may be their worst experience of their life, but I've gone through much worse by myself, and that to me is like, that's who I would want my mother, father, sister, brother to go to, is someone who's like done it, and that's the problem, which you point out, but it's not a problem in just the psychedelic community. Meaning what is posted in social media out there these days, in psychedelics, but anywhere, is people's good experiences, right? People aren't saying this went bad, I'm ashamed of this. It's like good, 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 likes. And the people that you and I see, it's in secret. This was a problem, right? People aren't out there, like it's like they're scared because for many viable reasons. Oh, they invested $5,000. They went to Peru to do ayahuasca and they don't feel better. They're not going to jump at posting that online because like that's the way culture is right now, right?
So
Like it's not just a psychedelic thing, it's a cultural issue right now that of people not wanting to talk about things that are painful. And just one last thing I want to say to hammer this home is that Rick Doblin again says we need to hear more stories. And it's not just psychedelic stories, it's all of them. I remember last time when we were talking, and this is something again with the men, the young men, boys population. I remember sharing this last time very intentionally, right? When I talked about struggles I had early when I was younger with porn and masturbation, and like I remember people were giggling, and I felt a little ashamed as I was talking about this. But if you think about it, like this is meaning like because some people were responding a certain way when I was looking at the chat. I do this because these are important things that I now know as a practitioner, as a person. This is stuff that is happening everywhere and no one is talking about it. And that's the thing, when we put things down, when we think it's just us, when we don't have guidance, that is when it brews underneath. That's what seems to get unleashed with psychedelics, but it's this years of cultural and family stuff that's been pushed down. It's not the psychedelic itself.
okay. So let me just try to recap for a second, make sure I understood you, because I think there's a lot of good stuff in there. So the first is you kind of mentioned that, you know, what I really like how this is the first time I've ever heard someone kind of define this, and I think it's a really fantastic definition that, you know, what is it that makes an elder? So there's a certain amount of like rite of passage, right? And some of those are grounded in gender dynamics and things like that. But really, it's when you sort of look at an elder healer, it's someone who has needed to heal themselves and has also shepherded other people's healing. And
Oh.
You kind of also mentioned that part of what we're sort of hearing is that there's a selection bias in the kinds of stories that we hear about psychedelics. Right now, that's going to be a very like almost like pro-positive bias on social media, which is one of sort of the effects of social media. Whereas I think depending on which corner of the internet you go to, and especially if you visit our subreddit recently, I think there's a lot of negativity. There's actually like a pro-negativity bias at times. But definitely in terms of psychedelics, I would agree with you that most of the people talking about it are talking about it in a very, very positive light. I'm still a little bit curious, though. I mean, even if I accept everything that you say, that, okay, like what we've lost is like a culture of like mentorship, elders, gurus. I completely agree with that, by the way, and we can talk about meditation in a second. So I have some thoughts there, but I'm still kind of curious, like, so as we look at these practicalities of like legal decriminalization, and we don't sort of have a culture that has these traditions, you know, I still find myself kind of concerned. So you're saying, okay, this is what an elder is. Completely agree with you. We've lost this culture. Completely agree with you. And then let's say over the next 5 years, we decriminalize all substances and make them available. Is that going to help more people than it's going to hurt without, because the key thing is that historically psychedelics have been practiced in a very, in a sense, quote unquote, regulated way. Right? It's not like random people using it. It's not that things have been owned, but I think there's a reason why these spiritual traditions, everything from the ancient Greeks, which they talked about, Native American traditions, which they've talked about, you know, there is a lot of essentially like, I don't know if the word control is fair. It feels a little bit harsh, but like there wasn't, or maybe there was freedom of use. But if we look at these traditions, these traditions have evolved to have oversight, let's say. And what I'm sort of noticing is that on the one hand, things may be medically overseen, which has some issues. But on the other hand, like these traditions, I think there's a reason why they have oversight. And a lot of what we're kind of seeing, at least politically right now, is a complete lack of oversight. What do you think about that?
I don't know if we see a complete lack, but so what I'll say is that something that you're not saying at all. I didn't hear you claim this, but being on the inside of the psychedelic movement, there's also something of a glamorization of indigenous cultures, meaning, oh, look how right they had it. The reality is they were also killing themselves. They were killing each other. I mean, they were at war. It's not as if these were like peaceful Garden of Eden people, like meaning they still had their human journey they were going through. You just happen to have some of them, you know, histories of intentional use of psychedelics. Again, but it's very it's romanticized right now, right? So that's just one thing that, and you could even see that in the documentary series. Another thing I want to say about the documentary series on Michael Pollan, you're right that they did not emphasize at all when things go bad. Say on the Netflix documentary that I was on, when was that? January 2020. I thought that we did a really good job. I mean, not biased, but kidding aside, is that in that one, we didn't even go into how difficult it could be. Meaning, we didn't even go into the stories of, gosh, these really painful, embarrassing things came up for me. That's where this documentary, did they go into the kind of what can go very wrong? No. They went into the stories of what got people to where they were struggling to begin with. We had people who were very vulnerable on there, talking, men especially, who were talking about their struggles, their abuse. So meaning, from my perspective, being in the field, this documentary has gotten more accurate than anything else out there. But yeah, is there still things that have been not talked about? Yes, but that's where I'm like, why it's important to actually have just more conversations about it. And I think that's, why I love coming on here. And specifically, I'm recording this Audible series, and this is where storytelling is crucial. And even having elders mediate conversations of just people sharing stories. Because, for instance, I'm recording this Audible project right now that'll be out in January. We were kind of recording the final parts right now. And I shared on there this week something that I had I forgot until a month ago. And so the episode focuses on me and my life. It's not just about psychedelics, but given the gun violence that I don't know, for some reason this year it's just impacted me more than it's ever impacted me. And it's often now the young white man who is blamed for that. And that's why I think and I'm assuming, I don't know the makeup of your audience, but I think it's a lot of young white men, and then on top of that, something that I've thought about, there's a lot of this white privilege thing, meaning it's like everyone's struggling, and I think young white men are struggling, and then there's one piece of many messaging out there is almost like white privilege, and you don't have a reason to complain or talk about it. And I think that, for instance, like when I think about gun violence, I think that's one of the reasons why we have it. It's like, it's obviously much more complex than that. But the thing I want to bring up is that during this recording last week, for this project, I remembered two instances. One I had remembered before already, but I had never shared it publicly, but I'll share it here now the second time publicly. Like the thing that actually got me into mental health treatment, I even repeated the semi-lie here. Oh, when I hit my rock bottom during my residency training, I actually had started about 4 years earlier therapy, because I had had a bad breakup, and I was having fantasies at that time of harming my ex, her new boyfriend, and killing myself. And that was for some reason, up until now, I'd been scared to share that. But that's what first got me into treatment. This was like in 2018.
Wow.
And the thing I remembered I only remembered the second one a month ago, which is when I was in my mid-20s, so years before that. I'd gotten into an argument with my parents, and that was like pretty normal. I grew up in a very, arguing in anger was a huge thing. Is that when I was in my mid-20s, I found that my dad had a shotgun hidden in our house. I found it was like wrapped in fabric, and I'd had fantasies of killing my family. And during one argument, I actually said that to my parents. I was like, I'm going to take that, and I'm going to hurt you at some.
Wow.
And I remember months later being disappointed because I went back home and I didn't see it. And I asked my dad, what did you do with that? And he said, I gave it to the police officer across the street who was a family friend. And I remember being pissed. And the reason why, I don't know, it's like weird. Neither of those two stories until recently have I felt comfort sharing. And now I actually don't feel discomfort sharing. I think it's crucial because people have these thoughts and we have these thoughts and we go there when we feel so alone and disconnected. And so that's why, it's again, this thing about psychedelics is about connection. It's about authenticity. It's about forgiveness, especially self-forgiveness. That is ultimately what needs to change in culture. It's not, again, the access or unaccess to psychedelics is only going to open up this thing. And if you think about access to something, that you know this very well as a doctor, what is the thing that opens up unconscious? disinhibits actually can make us more violent, much more frequently than psychedelics, is alcohol. You know, how much like criminal behavior, or sorry, I don't want to say criminal, violent behavior happens with alcohol. So I would say psychedelics are actually much, even if they were completely decriminalized and had access right now, we wouldn't see, I think, anything near, if we were to compare it to something that's become very normal, like alcohol now. Because again, people wouldn't take it as easily as alcohol because you have these chances of something painful coming up. So I actually, again, we don't know what's going to happen in the future. We need more guidance, but I don't think prohibition, which isn't what you're saying, I don't think limiting it to certain people is going to help us to actually do the healing work.
So
I know that I went on a long rant. There's a lot I said in there.
yeah, I think as you're kind of, I think a lot of your views are grounded in your personal experience, and I think sharing your own struggles and your own healing journey, I think, is like, you know, a very valuable part of telling a complete story. I also kind of heard you say that what you really liked about the docuseries was that it did do a very authentic telling, even if it left out certain parts like their potential downsides. It did a very it did honor to the tradition. It did honor to some of the research. It did honor to, you know, the role of elders and the proper settings and things like that. And as you kind of pointed out, in terms of, okay, almost like kind of safety, I think the documentary also had a quip about this, which I think is probably, I would agree with, that actually the most harm that we've done in society through mind-altering substances has actually been through prescribable substances, right? So if we're really looking at it like, you know, we have an opioid epidemic, and if we look at sort of like the two most dangerous substances statistically, it's going to be opioids and alcohol. And the opioid epidemic was absolutely influenced, propagated, depending on who you are and how nuanced you want to be, quote unquote, created by pharmaceutical companies and doctors kind of prescribing stuff and things like that. I don't really know about that stuff, but I think you can clearly say that, I mean, I would imagine that if you looked at real epidemiologic data and sort of looked at the negative impacts of psychedelic use versus the negative impacts of opioids and alcohol, probably the morbidity and mortality from opioids and alcohol is going to far outweigh what the damage that psychedelics have caused is.
And you say probably, and it's fair to say probably because we haven't done the study, but
right.
like
99% sure.
It just like you know what I mean, like.
Right.
Which is very important to say, you know. And yeah. I actually want to say one more thing about it. I actually thought about something that's important for you. The reason why I realized in the last month that I am now comfortable sharing about these very violent thoughts that I've had about towards others and myself is because I finally, now in the last year, now feel like I believe in my body. I know I will never hurt myself. Meaning, even up until the last year, even though I've done tons of self-work, even though I've done, you know, had lots of success in my life, that was still in the back of my mind and sometimes front of mind when I was feeling pain, something I would still think of. Not harming others, that I think was gone a few years ago, but harming myself. Meaning, like, a part of me was still like, oh, look, I'm doing all this stuff, I'm talking about it. Do I act, could I act on this one day? And it wasn't until recently where, like, after a couple other healing experiences with and without psychedelics, that I actually now know that will never happen, unless it's like because I'm in such chronic pain or something. But like the reason I bring up these stories about myself and why I think storytelling is so important is because I do believe I've gone through a lot. I don't love quantifying, but it's because I rarely think it's helpful, but I do think it's helpful in this situation. I have gone through a objective amount of large trauma through my life, whether it was physical beatings, whether it was religion, whether it was gang violence. And I got to the point of such pain and causing pain to other people and the brink of ruining my life. And I got myself out of it. And I think that's why it's really important for me to share my parts. And I think that's the elder thing. I haven't met a single one of those elders who I think are amazing, who are like, oh yeah, I was just great. I was born a fucking guru, and like, I was just awesome all your life. All of them have gone through these very challenging periods of their life, which ends up being that they don't judge me. They allow me to open up about things, and I feel safe. I don't feel rejected. I feel it's not that they're saying the things that I've done are like totally fine, but they're like, and we continue to see yourself work on them. And I think that's the type of elder that we need. And if we had more of those elders, we wouldn't even need psychedelics, right? If we had a more accepting, forgiving culture, we wouldn't need psychedelics at all, right? We're essentially trying to repair a disconnected culture.
So, Will, just to kind of recap, I think it's important. I really appreciate your storytelling of your own journey, because what I'm hearing is that you had a lot of objective trauma, you struggled a lot, and your desire to hurt other people kind of resolved years ago, but recently you've really sort of healed in terms of wanting to hurt yourself. And also an important part of that is that this is like a 10-year journey for you, or maybe even longer.
Yeah.
And so I think that's important. Is it okay if I kind of switch gears to a couple of other kind of like concepts or thoughts? So one thing that I thought was really remarkable was the consistency of particular experiences through psychedelics. So people will, for example, consistently experience some kind of communication, connection, or some kind of communication or connection with people that are no longer alive. So even in my practice, I've heard a shocking amount of, especially women, discussing some kind of healing around miscarriages and abortions. It just seems like a very like oddly common kind of thing, but that people will sort of have a connection to ancestors. They'll see like, their grandfather or whatever, like we'll sort of hear all these stories. How do you have any kind of insight, or can you share with us like what's going on when people on psychedelics basically have some sort of communication or connection with humans or beings that are like no longer in this world or alive? What do you think is going on there?
I'm giggling only because I've thought about this a lot. I certainly have an answer, but I mean, honestly, we could talk about this for 5 hours. So, so one of the things that I want to actually go back to a little bit, when I think about my examples of it, basically saying, look, I was willing to be very violent towards others, or at least had thoughts of violence towards others and thoughts of violence towards myself. I think of those two acts as being the most separation that we could ever cause, as opposed to the most togetherness that we could feel, the most connection. These are polar opposites, okay? And true, most classic psychedelics provide, at certain doses, provide a connection to something greater or something else, something that's out of our day-to-day view of me. I need to pay my rent. Does that person like me or not? They're leaving me, they're breaking. It gets us out of this like day-to-day thing that we've been programmed into, and it gives us some sense of there's something much bigger happening here. I'm part of something much bigger, whether that's a ancestor, whether that's a archangel, whether that's a aborted baby, whether that's some. It gives us this potential experience where we can, again, and I say potential because our interpretation of what that experience is that's up to us, or us and the guide, right? So that can be helpful for many people. That first psychedelic I took 10 years ago was like the most powerful one in terms of getting us to that state. It's called DMT. I smoked it. It's one that can get you, that like wipes out me, my life now in like 15 seconds. For a lot of people, that's incredibly intense. It's not one that I generally almost ever now would recommend anyone do, even though that's the first. I mean, it's not the one that I would first recommend to people, even though it was, again, I think that was just my own journey. So in general, that's what I think about these experiences. There are people, we call those non-ordinary states or transpersonal experiences. But again, non-ordinary compared to what is considered ordinary right now.
So what do you think
these
is
elders and these indigenous people, that connection to those spirits was normal. Like that was like everyday life. And so maybe that's why they were less violent, because they had connection. The last thing I want to say, though, is that MDMA specifically in that third episode, if people watch it, does not do transpersonal experiences. And I think there's a reason why MDMA is specifically powerful for Western culture. We can get in more details later. I just want to at least say that, is that MDMA, I've never had someone come in and be like, I talked to an ancestor on MDMA. That makes us actually see the connectedness of life right now. And that's very, very unique with MDMA.
Wait, Will, can you go into detail? Why do you think MDMA is specifically the most promising for Western culture?
Because of where Western culture lies right now, which it is primarily a Christian-based culture, a monotheistic culture. And I think that has played a big role into our overall culture, meaning we have these structures with heads at the top, CEOs, presidents, heads of departments. And so it's not just Christianity, it's that Christianity and this, like, we need that, there's this powerful thing at the top that knows right or wrong. We're certainly starting to question that now, especially
how does MDMA...
But there are parts where...
Sorry, how does MDMA target that structure?
Because it shows us our connectedness. Again, so the reason why I go back to this suicide and murder as being the most separation and violent, what the solution to that is going to be is to see our interconnectedness and our being part of something. Like for me, the reason why, I realized in a big, again, this took years, and I actually don't want to scare people off by saying it took me 9 or 10 years to get there. Does not mean that if anyone listening, the people listening here, I'm sure there's people listening that have had similar thoughts or are having them. I don't think it necessarily has to take other people 10 years, right? It's just like I had no guidance and I was just like, but that's my journey. But if you think of the antidote, when I think about why me or any of the patients I have ever seen want to kill themselves, is because they feel separate from the world. They feel separate from the others. They feel alone. That is the common thing. I've never met anyone who is suicidal, again, outside of chronic pain from like end of life stage cancer. It's like, I'm suicidal and I have a loving girlfriend who I really love hanging out with, and my family loves me. Like we hug. Like no one ever comes in suicidal that way. So I'm saying, like, violence, whether it's to yourself or to others, means I feel very separate. The antidote is, do I feel together? And what's getting in the way of feeling togetherness? MDMA, that's why I love it, is because it stays here in the interpersonal, right? Like meaning, is it interesting? Do I believe in connections with ancestors and spirits? I do, but it took me years to get there, and it was scary for me in the beginning because I, at the time, was atheist. And so part of the reason why I have some hesitation around ayahuasca and say magic mushrooms is and that's why, again, but it's poised already where MDMA is going to be the first one that's medicalized, is because, again, that scares senators and Republicans who were still Christian into being like, oh my God, they're dealing with evil spirits. Like, we've got to crush this down again, right? So MDMA, since it doesn't get into the spiritual stuff, I think is more gentle towards your average Westerner, and it certainly was more gentle with.
So let me just make sure I understand you. So what I'm kind of noticing is that when you sort of talk about Western culture, things are quite hierarchical, and by virtue of the hierarchy, there's separation of people, right? I'm me, you're you, one of us is above, one of us is below. There's an employer.
You're better, you're the, exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
And so I'm also kind of hearing you say that you think that hierarchical approach is somehow related to Christianity. I think a little bit beyond the scope of what I'd like to talk about today, if that's okay with you. But fine. So Western system is hierarchical. The next thing is that, and as you sort of talk about, violence against yourself or violence against other people, that too is an extreme hierarchy, where the hierarchy becomes so separate that we're like at opposite ends of the spectrum. There's no connection. There's no isolation. I would also agree with you. Maybe this is a little bit controversial, but a lot of the people that I've worked with who are suicidal, I don't know that all of them are actually mentally ill. I know it's kind of a shocking thing to say.
Oh,
There's actually
definitely, yeah.
there's actually
No,
some
I don't think so. I agree with you.
yeah, so there's actually some interesting research here that shows that suicide attempts may not actually correlate as much with mental illness as we thought. And that really what's going on is that people do feel incredibly isolated. They feel trapped. And sometimes that can almost be like an accurate representation of their actual life. And it isn't actually a cognitive distortion.
Totally.
And so what I'm kind of hearing you say is that MDMA, without bothering into the transpersonal, which I want to ask you more questions about, breaks down kind of the barriers between me and other and fosters that kind of connection. And since we're a society that feels so separate, feels so us and them, what we the first step that we really need before we even get to connecting to the ancestors is we need to connect with each other, like as human beings. So
yeah, and this is where Rick has, okay, actually, no, it sounds like you had a question, sorry.
Yeah, well, so I just want to touch on for a second, like the default mode network and the ego. So this is something that the docuseries kind of talks about, that we have this part of the brain called the default mode network, which is kind of like our capacity for self-reflection or a sense of identity, or ways to kind of simplify it. If you've got more precise language for it, feel free to share. And that a lot of these psychedelics, and I think they talk about the default mode network in the MDMA episode, but that essentially what some psychedelics do, and we sort of, is that they allow us to step away from our identity, right? So I think of myself as successful or a loser. I think of myself as tall or short. I think of myself as, we have these constructions of self, which we kind of assume are true. And what some psychedelics appear to be the mechanism of action through which some of them work. And we also know, for example, that the default mode network can almost be hyperactive in periods of major depression or depressive episodes. And that even treatments like, they didn't talk about ketamine, but one of the interesting mechanisms of action of ketamine is that it seems to suspend the activity of the default mode network, which is why it can be such a quick treatment for depression. And so I'm just a little bit curious, like, what do you think about, do you have any thoughts about the default mode network, the ego, and psychedelics effects on those things?
Yes, of course. I've thoughts about everything.
Okay.
I laugh and giggle a little bit because part of what I want people in my messaging in general, and I want to share also with people here, is these things. When I talk about separation, when I talk about violence, when I talk about isolation, and that those things cause pain, and they lead some people to then behave in painful ways to themselves or others. And to feel connected, appreciated, loved leads to people feeling joy and purpose. I don't know if I've ever seen a study that shows either of those things, and I don't need, because that is my experience of life, and I've seen that myself, and I've seen it in other people. And I think anyone listening connects with it for the same reason. The only reason I bring that up right now is because if you think about, if we keep these medicines, which are about connection and connectedness, and the analogy I've thought of, or the metaphor recently, is that if you've had a carpenter working on your house for the last 40, 50 years, the metaphor is the carpenter to psychiatry, and that your house is basically falling apart. You've had more leaks, like your extensions are crumbling, meaning mental illness has gotten worse, suicide has gotten worse, and all of a sudden that carpenter walks in and is like, hey, you know what? Like, your house is falling apart and I've got a brand new set of power tools. Do you trust me? The issue is that it's not the tool, it's the system. And so most of the site, even the published now, like, people who are scientists who are getting a platform in psychedelics, I know most of them personally, but you don't even have to know this to, like, again, the people who choose to stay in systems like academia, like Harvard, like that, pull a certain type of person. It's not all of a sudden that we got a bunch of heart open, now we psychiatrists get it. They're looking at the new tool, the same approach that they had done before. And I'm seeing this over and over and over. And I think that's why the messaging is so messed up. And when I said earlier that Capitalism is interesting. It's just basically the old models are just seeping in and saying, oh, now we've got psychedelics. That's most of what we're seeing now. So going to your question specifically, the reason I giggle a bit with the default mode network is there's one specific study, and the thing is, there's one guy in particular. I'm not here to like judge people, but I'm saying like one or two guys who've gotten a huge name for themselves in the psychedelic therapy world. It's because they've done a lot of brain imaging. Again, if we had endless resources and the world wasn't crumbling and we weren't destroying the environment, is it interesting to do the science? Sure. Like, I think that's pretty cool. But if we have NIH, who now to date has only now funded one psychedelic study, they still resist funding it. We are destroying the environment. We are getting much more violent. Again, are we going to say, okay, let's let things move at the pace of science and trust that these people who have already kind of thought, like they've kind of had their shot and it hasn't been working. So, and the reason why I want to connect that back to the first thing I said is this thing about connectedness and separateness leading to feeling good and feeling bad. That is a basic human thing that I do not need science to tell me. Anything, science is part of what actually may keep us from trusting that in ourselves. And the last thing I wanted to say about that. So, and the other thing is that, the amount of healing work that I've gone through myself and that I've now seen other people go through with and without psychedelics, that I then share. I've never seen my default mode network. I've never seen my amygdala or their amygdala. I've never seen whatever we're talking about in these studies. What I have seen is people opening up about things that they have thought were unlovable about them, things that they were ashamed of, things that they thought they were going through alone, sharing them. And when they feel that they are not alone with that and they're not judged, I see people feel better. Okay, like that is the most important thing for me is the humanness and the authenticity and the vulnerability that I've experienced. So again, whether it's default mode, this, that, I don't know. Like to me, that's, again, it's just less interesting because like we can get lost in this stuff and not do the human connectedness piece.
So can I just respond, like share some thoughts about that? So the first is, I appreciate what you're saying, and especially with your analogy that if we have a model of the way that we deliver healing right now in the West, which is a medical model. And I think that part of the reason that we actually do this, right? So like we're streaming right now on the internet, and part of what we do here at HG is because, at least I believe, there are shortcomings to the medical model. And one thing that I just want to point out is I was looking at all these like transformative healing experiences, and I was just thinking, I don't know if you noticed this and if people have watched the documentary, but like the rooms that these patients are in, they're in a room that's gorgeous. There's sunlight, there are fresh flowers. They hand you your pill in a bowl. Every time you take your psychedelic, someone rings a bell. There are two human beings who are there with you. They're like, and then I just remember like our training, right, at places like MGH and McLean. I don't know how many of y'all have seen the inside of a psychiatric hospital, and McLean is one of the nicest psychiatric hospitals out there. And it's like there's a plastic mattress, a plastic pillow, locked doors, minimal sunshine. You are like not allowed to go outside. The food is like, I wonder how much of the therapeutic benefit of the studies have to do with the pill that you're taking, and how much of it actually have to do with like this environment where there's like sunshine and trees and human beings are there, and like your room is pretty nice, and there's like literally like fresh flowers in your room. Like I've never seen that in a psychiatric hospital.
So you said how much is what? I would actually say, again, do all of these little things, the different factors of what's going to make someone feel more connected to themselves, more accepted, more loved. I like thinking sometimes in the form of dualities because I think it can be helpful, meaning if we were doing a psychedelic session in a house that was elevated above the 405 freeway here in LA during rush hour and there's horns and sirens, is that going to impact things and make them less likely healing, more separating? Yes. You have the other extreme of being in complete nature and being in the middle of a rainforest, and can that help? Yes, but none of those in alone is going to do it. The most important thing is this not being alone with something that you have been alone with for a long time. So meaning, essentially, you could have the most beautiful, gentle room or be in the rainforest, but if you have, using your words, a emotionally plastic human being that is your guide, it's not going to work. And that could even turn into a bad trip, meaning because I've seen this over and over where this is where, because psychedelics are becoming such an industry, and not because for a bad reason. It's just right now we're at this place where interest in psychedelics, but really interest in healing and feeling better, has far outpaced the number of people who know how to work with them. That's the problem, right?
I
That
see.
people, for good reason, are hungry and want to feel better. And so, but you've got also these guides, you and I, the thing that's always nice for me is like, sometimes do psychedelic therapy. Sometimes use ketamine therapy. I have the backup of I'm always a doctor and I can make a living without this. You've got all these people out there now who are sound healers or yoga teachers who are like, holy fuck, now people are willing to pay me $2,000 to come to my place and I give them mushrooms, and they're making tons of money now. And they're being much less careful, and they haven't had the experience, or desiring to be patient with this and being like, that might be too much for me. This person I think I can handle. And that's the piece where it's like you have a lot of guides who don't even know their own limitation right now. And so, because in order to say hold the pain of someone else, if you think about all that shit that I've been through, I don't really get scared when someone comes in is like, I've been having these suicidal thoughts.
So,
I'm like, please tell me more about that.
well,
Tell
I mean,
me, because
I think
but it's only been because I've gone through that.
so. Just to kind of
Yeah.
respond to that. So I think that's so. What I'm sort of hearing, I heard you say a couple of things, and I think in a sense, I agree with a lot of what you're saying. So the first is that some of the stuff around the science and the default mode network, what I'm kind of hearing you say is that that's not where the money is. The money is in connection. The money is in tradition. The money is in experience. And I mean, not the literal money. I mean, the value, right? And I sort of, in a sense, agree with you that when we take some of these things and we bring them into the medical model, there are some things that are lost and some things that are gained. I definitely understand this like very, very well when it comes to meditation. Because I've sort of, practiced personally, and I also use it in treatment. And there's almost like a medical appropriation of meditation going on. And the biggest example of that is actually the term mindfulness. So what's happening is we're starting to use terms that are actually like medical versions or scientific versions that are remove a lot of the spirituality. And there are actually some good reasons for that. The concern that I have is that, you're kind of saying that there are a bunch of people out there that are basically charging $2,000 for some kind of facilitated healing, and they're not really that qualified because the interest in this stuff outweighs the competency. And so that's where I think the science kind of comes in, because like you say, I don't need to see a study to see its value. And what I'm wondering is every person out there who's charging $2,000 doesn't need to see studies. They don't need quality control because they understand it, right? So internally, they feel like they have an understanding of it. And so that's like sufficient. And that's kind of what makes me interested in the science. And as someone who's, was quite skeptical of psychedelics, it's really the science that's in a sense gotten me kind of curious about it, because what I sort of found in the complementary and alternative medicine world, like, so I'm a certified Reiki healer. I'm a certified Bach flower remedy person. But what I sort of found in my own journey of complementary and alternative medicine is that there's a lot of stuff out there that can be useful. So even when it comes to things like energy healing, I've seen anecdotal experience of very good outcomes with energy healing. But what I haven't seen is any kind of quality control or consistency. And so what I ended up leaning into, just in terms of my own personal journey, was like yoga and meditation, because that had some amount of like scientific rigor behind it. And so I'm kind of curious. I mean, I sort of get what you're saying about the shortcomings of the medical model, the shortcomings of even sort of some amounts of scientific exploration. But I think it's sort of a lack of that stuff, which is precisely what's creating some of the problems that you're talking about, which is that everyone's like, I know it in my bones, therefore it's okay. What do you think about that?
Well, that goes into a topic I think we went to a little bit last time. Well, we're not, I think we went into it more than a little bit. Is that, and this is, I think, part of that becoming an elder thing. Again, and I don't want to say there's such a thing as elder or not. What I'm saying is that is a connection to emotions, right? To me, emotions are our GPS, what is right or wrong or aligned or misaligned with who I am. And there's this term called dissociation, which we use in psychiatry very specifically, but it's not meaning we have this thing where we're like, oh, this person's dissociating from their mind or from their body. I actually believe dissociation, significant dissociation from the body and emotions is probably present, I would say, in 98 to 99% of people in the Western world. Significant dissociation. And that starts from all these things that we're talking about in childhood, culture, etc. Meaning, I agree that science has identified something significant, but we are only seeing the extremes of dissociation, not admitting people making the studies and making the categories themselves are dissociated. The reason why I bring up emotions is that if in the case that we are not connected, and most people are not significantly connected to emotion, they may truly believe in the mind that they understand something. They're not understanding it in the physical body, in the somatic experience. And that's a whole nother. But the thing about this elder thing is building true self-understanding of these signals. So, and because the thing is and that is, like I said, that'll be a whole nother topic. No, well, one more thing I want to say is that this thing, science, I'm not saying is not valuable. I actually think science is most valuable. Try to convince scientists that what matters is human connection. Like, meaning there's all these different ways that each of us, because of our history, our culture, our family, our occupation, have been separated. And science is one example of that. So for scientists to help convince themselves, I'm happy to do that. Or for people who value that mind thing. But if the scientists doing the studies are sitting in the room with people having these experiences and don't know how to handle, look like a negative study where it didn't work. So that's the thing. We don't know. So quality control, do we need it? Absolutely. Do we need more training? Yes. I just don't think that's going to come from only science. And honestly, I don't know if there's a singular thing that's going to do that. The reason why I brought up emotion is that solidness of quality control comes from within.
Okay. I think that makes a lot of sense. One thing that I wanted to that you touched on that I wanted to go back to is, so we talked about how MDMA may be the most useful. It's also, I think, the closest to getting FDA approved. But you mentioned some of the more transpersonal psychedelics. And the other things that I kind of wanted to touch on, I thought this was super interesting because the docuseries essentially talked about something like collective consciousness, right? Where, and you've been kind of really highlighting this theme of like separating. So right now we exist as separate, unique, discrete individuals, and something about what psychedelics do is they allow us to form connections. And I thought it was really interesting. There was one case of someone who felt, or actually, they're very specific with their language. They didn't say, I thought I died. They died. That was their experience, that they experienced death, not ego death, not felt like they died. They're very actually particular in saying that I died. And then I became dirt, and that dirt became a tree. Yeah. And this is a tree. And then I saw from the tree, I was the tree, and I saw myself and my son and my wife, I think, walking down the path. And I saw like my human form, like break a piece of the branch, and I like played with my son. And it was like a very like healing experience for this person. And some people are sort of talking about, connecting to these other beings. I remember seeing one study where I thought this was bizarre. A study on DMT where 92 or 93% of people who used DMT, it was a small trial, maybe like 32 people, reported like connecting with some kind of like transcendental being, like otherworldly being. And it's a very conserved experience. And so, as I read some of these experiences around psychedelics, when I've talked to people who've worked with psychedelics and things like that, what I'm sort of reminded of is some experiences I've had in meditation. And what I'm really kind of curious about is that, like, it's kind of interesting that psychedelics people consistently have these experiences, which the meditative tradition kind of assumes is the nature of the world. So, like, reincarnation, this idea that, like, consciousness can become different life forms, and that there is, like, the fundamental makeup of the universe is actually collective consciousness. In the Sanskrit, it's called Brahman. And that, like, actually part of the source of our suffering is actually when we break apart from the whole, and that we become ensconced within our own ego or identity. And it also gets kind of interesting when you look at the science, because it seems like meditation, one of the mechanisms of meditation is that it deactivates the default mode network, which is sort of where a sense of identity comes from. And I was just kind of curious about, what do you think about, like, reincarnation, collective unconscious, like transpersonal sort of experiences in psychedelics? Yeah. Like, what do you think?
No, again, I'm laughing again because we could probably talk for 8 hours about this.
So what do you think about that stuff? Like, what's going on when someone uses a substance? Is this?
Yeah, I mean, I can answer that by, so. Do I personally believe that, say, I don't consider actually myself religious, and even up actually until 6 months ago, like I said, when I first started this journey 10 years ago, I would have called myself atheist. Up until 8 months, a year ago, I would have called myself spiritual. Actually, I don't like that term anymore. I actually don't think of myself as even spiritual anymore, because I think that I'll get into why. Is that, do I personally believe in, have I had experiences and have I seen other people go through experiences that make me feel very solid that we come from something much greater than our daily minds can understand, that is so incredibly complex, and the words I use is complex, magnificent, awe, just awe. I believe that. And I believe that's also that same place that we will go to. And that some people might call that God, some people might call that, as you said, Brahman, whatever terms. Ultimately, I think while we are in these bodies, we cannot know that, because we are here. We are separate. We are in physical bodies. So so do I believe in what people refer to as reincarnation sometimes, etc.? Yeah, I believe in that. I have my own, I don't call it those things, because I have found that even as perhaps as critical as I'm coming off as science, I actually have now found that within spirituality. Meaning, because I dove into Buddhism and I dove into meditation for a while. And I have, a lot of friends that are in the Vipassana meditation, especially. And I believe a lot of human suffering, especially what we're talking about, is the separation of mind, body, spirit. I think right now in the Western world, like, that body stuff that I'm talking about, that isn't even in the conversation. My feeling, emotion, I need to, meaning this is going to take time to unfold. We're, like, basically in mind right now, right? Current 2020, like, we are mind, we think about things. Something that came up during our conversation that I've talked to a lot of other people. Talking about emotions is not the same as feeling emotions. Thinking about emotions is not the same as embodying and engaging your emotions with other people. So sometimes we trick ourselves, especially I've seen in people in the meditation community, that thinking about things and understanding things is the same as embodying it, right? Living it. And to me, that is a major way that people can escape within this spiritual stuff. So, or again, these transpersonal things. So that's why for me, MDMA, I love that it's become the one. And I haven't actually asked Rick. I'm pretty sure he probably selected it because of what we're talking about right now. Is that you're right in what you said earlier. So did I explore DMT and these other things earlier? Yeah, but you know what? I was still struggling on my day-to-day basis in my relationships, at work, with romance. And that's when I was finally like, what the fuck is the point of connecting to God, whatever, even if I think it's real, if I'm struggling on a day-to-day basis? And then the focus for me then became healing my relationships, healing, like, the stuff, understanding my family dynamics better, working on myself day to day. And as that got much better, then I started re-exploring these other things. But it was like, I think that the human connectedness on a day-to-day basis is what kept me going. And the last thing I want to say, that when I say I was still suicidal or thinking of suicide in the last 1 to 2 years, it was very different than it was 10 years ago. When it was 10 years ago, it was because I didn't feel like I had good friends. I felt like I couldn't hold a romantic relationships. When I felt suicidal in the last year or two, because I feel like I had almost like I'm aware of this other thing. I'm aware that I'm part of this bigger thing. And it's very painful for me to be out here right now because it seems like the vast majority of the human population isn't able to engage with me in that way. And so I felt alone for a very different reason. I actually felt that. So that's why I think this balance of how much we dip into these very profound things is very important because we have to balance it with how where we are and able to function and engage in a day-to-day basis as a human within our ego.
So, Will, can I just...
And sorry, and the last thing, just one last thing, because I think it'll be of interest to you specifically, is when, this is what my exploration around Buddhism, Hinduism, etc., is that somewhat, I think, I fell into this, and I think a lot of people do. It's like, oh, Buddhism, this is how old it is. Look, the Buddha, there's this beautiful story. But I'm like, even if there was someone named the Buddha who came up with us, it's still a story. He didn't know that for sure. He was still a human. He was still a person in a body trying to come up with an explanation which sounds beautiful, which makes sense. Same thing as Carl Jung. He was still a human trying to figure this out. Even if you have tens of millions or hundreds of millions of people that believe in an idea, doesn't make, because the example that I'll give people is if we simply said because this has been around for a certain amount of time or hundreds of millions of people believe in it, then I could say, oh, well, Trumpism is all real because that guy got over 100 million people to like believe him. So to me, that's where I started going back to this last crucial thing, which is trusting ourselves. I don't think we should outsource our trust to science or religion or Buddhism, anything. It's like ultimately we are humans, and how do we understand our experience is the most crucial thing.
So just thanks for sharing, especially that last point, because I'd love to talk about that. But so if I understood you, I'm going to kind of tunnel down. So what I'm kind of curious about is a question that may feel reductionistic to you, Will. So if it is, just let me know. But you mentioned something that what reality is not. You can experience some taste of that potentially through psychedelics, but that, so some people may argue that anything that you experience through psychedelics is essentially like a hallucination of neurons firing. There's kind of a biological reductionism, right? That like even if I experience an ancestral being, it's not that the ancestral being is quote unquote real. It's just my neurons are firing in a particular way, which gets interpreted in my brain as this experience. And it's all sort of like biological reductionism. On the flip side of it is like there is like this kind of cosmic reality. And what I'm sort of hearing you kind of say is that as a human being, you are bound by this form to maybe get a taste of it, maybe get a glimpse of it, but that you can never really know. And that Buddha and science and everything else is kind of limited from knowing what is really out there. So am I kind of understanding that correctly? Like, so like, but do you think?
Yes. And I want to add additional nuance to it. Yeah.
So let me just ask kind of a kind of discrete kind of yes or no question, and by all means, don't answer it in a yes or no way. But, so do you think that what people experience in psychedelics is closer to real reality than what? So it's like freeing us from the restrictions of our body and our mind, and then we're able to experience reality in a more true sense? Or do you think that like it's more, I don't think you're in the biological reductionist camp, but I just wanted to kind of like, is that what you think is going on? That these experiences that we have are real, that there's something real about connection and becoming a tree and all this kind of stuff? Like what?
So things, and this is just to play a little bit around this biological thing. You said, okay, we're having this experience right now and our neurons are firing. How do you know that? You see my neurons? Can you see yours? So what's real to me right now? Literally right now. I don't even know if I have a neuron. I've not looked in my brain. I have, again, evidence that shows that if someone dies and you open the skull, there's a brain. Sure. I've never seen one of my neurons. And I'm being very, again, these are kind of just the way my mind works. So meaning what is real to me and I know is real right now is I am sitting at, I was almost going to say my address, but I won't. On the 8th floor of this building, I'm looking out. There's a beach. This is Los Angeles. I'm looking into a computer and this program called Discord, which is the second time I've ever used Discord, talking to Dr. K, who I met years ago. That is what I know is real. That is it. Everything else that I try to explain is just my mind doing something. So just a story. And so going back to this thing about, and this is I'm glad you reminded me of this. So when you were talking about, hey, like there's this thing called, some people or some groups of people, including Buddhists, will say there's such a thing as ultimate reality. There's what's real. This is where I have started building nuance for myself and where I started actually not feeling associated or as connected to Buddhism. Because I don't actually believe that that other thing is more real, more important, higher than this right now, than me talking to you on this old laptop on Discord. Meaning like that still pushes in the, oh, that's a higher realm, that's we're just here. That is the stuff within spirituality that I do not connect with because it leads to some of the same separation and garbage that I see in politics. Meaning, but I want to add more nuance. While someone is experiencing unity and the cosmos and complete dissolution or death of their ego, while they are experiencing that with psychedelics, or as you would pointed out, without them, I think that is real because that's as real to them in that moment as talking on this laptop is to me and you right now. See the nuance there, right? Meaning, and this is like, there's a beautiful story in the book, Teachings of Don Juan by Carlos Castaneda, which I think if anyone here is interested in these themes, it's one of the best books out there, where basically Carlos is like Don Juan's protege or his sort of apprentice. And in that book, Carlos Castaneda takes mescaline, which is covered in the 4th episode. It's a cactus-based psychedelic. He has this powerful experience. I think he turns into a crow. He flies across this Mexican Sonoran desert at night, then kind of comes back to, and then is talking to Don Juan. And Don Juan's kind of like, okay, so what happened? He's like, oh my God, Don Juan, I turned into a crow and I flew. And he asked Don Juan, he's like, did you fly? It's like, did I fly? Did I really turn into a crow? Did I fly? And Don Juan basically summarizing was like, you idiot, did you learn anything? You told me you flew. You told me that you turned into a crow. Why are you questioning that? Like you had that experience. Because by nature, what I'm saying is like, to me, the most present thing we can be doing, and I don't know, a lot of people listening may or may not be following, but I know it's like, because you vibe so much with Buddhism, I know this is of interest to you. It's like, ultimately, it's can we reduce everything to that being fully present, right? And to me, that's why like all of these things are real. So if someone tells me they had an experience that they turned into a tree, I don't doubt that. That was real to them. That happened. I just question when then other people like, that's ultimately reality and the human experience is less than. I don't vibe with that. And that's going back to MDMA, why I think this connection to being human while we are in the human body is priority, because that is what we know is real right now.
Yeah. So great. So let me just make sure I understood. So you're kind of saying that you don't, even the question of biological reductionism versus kind of personal experience, you don't place a value judgment on, let's say, objective reality. And when you ask the question, how do we know you have neurons? And that's where it's like, well, science tells us so, right? And that's where like science is different from experience.
That you have it right now. That's different. I agree that science has said that most crack open people's skulls, they have a brain, there's neurons there. So, but that's still an idea. I'm just trying to like pierce it down because I think any ideas that we hold is definitely true that are not happening right now, still assumptions.
I'm with you, and I tend to, generally speaking, agree with your viewpoint. I'm just kind of laying it out, right? So like there's kind of this interesting perspective, which even as someone who leans heavily on science, I kind of acknowledge that the foundation of my experience of reality is experience, right? And that we sort of think about an objective reality. I think that gets into philosophy and stuff that I'm not really well versed in. But I think the key thing here that I think is kind of interesting, and so this is where my experiences have sort of led me to a different conclusion in some ways. So I do think that we are not, or my experience has led me to believe that we are not quite as bound by the body as your experience has led you to believe. So I think that this is where, when you practice meditation, it's kind of interesting because I feel like I understand a lot of things that people who have had psychedelic or psychotic experiences understand in terms of experiencing reincarnation, in terms of experiencing collective consciousness, things like that. The weird thing is that in meditation, it's just not as sexy. So the weird thing about my meditative experiences is I still have experienced those things, but it's just not as vibrant or a sensory experience. And what it is it's much more like basic in the fabric of what I experience now. So my experiences of meditation and reincarnation and all that kind of stuff feels to me more like gravity, where it's not something extraordinary that people talk about. It's almost something that's so simple and built into the fabric of our world that it's kind of taken for granted. And the other kind of thing, just to, when you're sort of saying where I kind of part ways with Buddhism is that at the end of the day, it's just kind of a belief, because what Buddhism sort of says is that there's a higher reality and there's a lower reality. And the moment that you do that, right, there's like the pleb humans and then there are the enlightened humans. You're creating separation, you're creating a judgment, you're splitting things up. To which I would say even your rejection of Buddhism is doing precisely the same thing, right? So you're sort of saying that, I reject Buddhism because Buddhism sort of selects this and therefore I'm kind of rejecting it. You're still in that process creating a separation. And that's where I think it's kind of interesting, because a lot of your beliefs are actually very in line with kind of Buddhist beliefs, specifically this idea of Advaita Vedanta, which is not, it's more Hindu in origin. But Advaita Vedanta is the principle of non-dualism, to recognize that any kind of duality, any kind of separation is actually a function of the mind and is not actually in reality. And so that's kind of interesting. But, that was just kind of my response to what you said. I don't have a clear question for you, but.
Well, two things I would say that I think that, one thing you said is that, perhaps I feel that, perhaps you said, I feel like, we're more attached to our bodies, something to the effect that than you do. I don't agree with that. I think we are attached to our bodies, and our conscious awareness is in our body. That's all I'm saying. And when we're not, it sounds like some of the experiences that you had, I don't know, because I didn't have. When you're not attached to that body, I think that's, at that moment, more valid than being in a body. That's all I'm saying. It's just that wherever our conscious awareness is, where we are thinking from, is what's real for any of us at that moment. And I actually don't say I reject Buddhism. I actually just say that it's an idea, and it's a set of ideas that don't resonate with me and where I have had experience. I actually think, again, if Buddha was alive right now and engaging with us, he would probably say there's many things that Buddhism has picked up that he was not trying to communicate. Meaning, do I think, if we could get to the fundamental, if there is a piece of writing that was truly his and we can confirm, I'm not saying I reject it. I'm like, that was his experience, and I think that's a very real one. It was real for him and completely real if he was able to document all that. I'm just saying it's not necessarily real for someone in 2022, in Ojai, California, going to a meditation retreat, talking about the ideas of Buddha who hasn't experienced it. That's all I'm saying. I'm not rejecting it. I'm just saying each person's experience is valid for them. That's all I'm saying in general.
I thanks for clarifying. I think what I was sort of, my experiences in meditation, and I think this is where there is a tradition here, and I think the tradition does a very good job of explaining a lot of these nuances. So one other thing that I kind of appreciate a lot is that, what is the true nature of reality? And there's a phrase in Sanskrit that's neti neti. And what that means is not this, not this. So anything that the mind, so if I say, is reality good or bad? And people who are quote unquote enlightened or had these particular experiences, and that's where I do disagree a little. Well, I don't know if it disagree, but one of the things that I've come to appreciate having studied spiritual traditions is that I do believe that there is a consistent way to get to a point of shared experience. So I think that like human beings have all these varied experiences, but in the same way that we can expect common things if people take MDMA or DMT or LSD, we can also expect common things and almost a quote unquote end of the road if you practice meditation in a particular way. And I think the really interesting thing about meditation is you're kind of talking about the importance of like tradition and elders and things like that, is that I think the most psychedelic meditation techniques are actually still held within these very, very tightly regulated meditative traditions. So people will like, you can sign up for any Kundalini yoga class in your local yoga studio, but in my experience, I've having been taught certain esoteric meditation techniques, I think that like there's a very clear understanding in the meditative tradition that a tradition and elders and guidance and this idea of a guru is actually very, very important to using these techniques, because when they're just like sort of psychedelics, you're kind of playing with fire, and fire is neither good nor bad. It's just how you use it. But anyway, I just...
One thing I wanted to share is that, so again, if there are paths that are very helpful, and they're very helpful for a large number of people to get to this place of whatever we want to call it, healing, unity, whatever, that's fine. I just don't think there's any one of them that's universal to everybody, and I think that, because ultimately, again, what I go to is that we're born with this stuff. Well, and essentially, if we could say, well, thing is like, again,
But Will, I mean, when you say we're...
Let me say this. This is something that if we could take a survey of the people who are listening to this or were listening to this, how engaged they felt with our conversation, how relevant they felt it was to their everyday life. I actually feel it wouldn't be this latter part. It's going to be the part about talking about, I would actually guess, the violence that I went through, the struggles that I went through. And I think that's the part where I think we need that's why it's crucial. Again, thinking about emotions, thinking about enlightenment, talking about the path to this is different than just embodying it and doing it. And that's the piece where I think it's crucial, because again, did maybe some people find this latter part of our conversation interesting? Sure, I think it's interesting. But the thing is, I don't know if it helped them feel more connected to me. I think, like, again, this history of like, look, I've had these very violent thoughts, I've had this, and that I bet resonates, and just people felt more connected, engaged. And that to me is the humanness that, again, going back to psychedelics and MDMA, is I think that is, while we are in a human body, basically trying to be as human as we can and feel as human as we can connected to other humans feels like priority. And I think that is what is referred to as presence, or stuff in these Eastern philosophies, which I do, again, they're valuable, they are useful, they're beautiful, I think they're fascinating. Just think that ultimately it's just human experience, being as present in the moment as we can.
So Will, I'm sort of inclined to both resonate with and disresonate with things that you said, right? Which is like understandable given our unique experiences. But it's interesting because you'll say things like, I don't think that there is like one path, which sort of makes sense. And at the same time, if we listen to what your words are, you do speak to a universality, right? So you talk about, for example, the fundamental issue of us versus them, the fundamental issue of not being embodied in your experience. And the way that you're talking about it, and maybe this is a misinterpretation of mine, but when I hear you talk, that sounds, I'm going to use a more scientific word, conserved, right? So that sounds universal. Like that sounds like it's like the bedrock of what it means to be human. So if that's the case, then kind of my question to you, I guess in a sense I'm making an argument, not really asking you a question, but is that if there were a path that were rooted in these fundamentals, right? Like, that implies to me that if we have a shared common experience that we can sort of like agree throughout the history of humanity, and agreement is a whole different thing. But if we just assume for a moment that human beings have some kind of common experience, that we have, neurons, whatever, but like that, we're embodied in we have to embody our emotions. There's us versus them. The more we move away from us versus them, the more we bring joy into our lives and things like that. If these things are kind of the bedrock of human existence, and maybe you don't think that they're the bedrock of human existence, then I would think that leaning into that path would be like sort of the best path. What do you think?
Yes. I think I don't know if bedrock, yeah, I wouldn't use that word. It seems to, at least for the last few thousand years, it's us versus them. That just seems to be true for the last 1,000 years. Again, if we want to get more into my beliefs, this is just because, again, I appreciate our conversations always, is that I don't know if that was true 10,000 years, 15,000 years. It may have been. So meaning it seems to be a very bedrockish thing at this time. And, again, when we think of pain or togetherness, the thing that everyone is kind of like, I don't like what's happening, is violence and separation, is killing each other, killing the environment. It's just my observation right now. But again, if we think about like, okay, so what role does humans play and all the, we can talk about that and I think it's fascinating. Again, something that Rick specifically has always brought me back to is because I've had all these conversations with, and for sometimes I was like, oh, Rick doesn't go there, but he hung out with all these guys at Esalen and Stan Groff and did it. And ultimately what he chose is, again, seeing who he is now. That's why I love that this third episode focused on him. Ultimately was like, I am human right now. What can I do to embody my humanness and help other people's, like I even asked him, I'm like, Rick, oh my God, you did all this stuff. Are you gonna write a book, your autobiography? He's like, I don't know, maybe one day. There's just too much to do right now. And the way I read that, when he always teaches me by just sharing stories. He doesn't ever criticize me. He's like, the way I took that was like, he's like, I'm living my book. I don't want to write my book right now. And to me, that's this, I can talk about I can write about my healing path, or I can like engage the healing path, or in that connection path right now. And for me, that's what I have felt. I feel most vital. I feel alive when I'm engaging with humans, and does that mean I'll write? I'll probably will write a book later, but I just feel, again, this vitality, this engagement is what I seek now. It just feels, again, that's human. I think when we don't feel that engagement is when people tend to suffer, and so, and there's a lot of that, again, in Buddhism. Of any of the spiritual things that I have ever explored, yes, that is in Buddhism. But what I'm saying is, like, it's not the only thing. Like, it's just the depths of some of Islam that I've gotten into, even the depths of esoteric Christianity. And growing up Jehovah's Witness, that was the last one I ever thought I would find. There are versions of esoteric Christianity that are saying the exact same thing that we're talking about.
Yeah. Well, Will, any last thoughts or questions? We're kind of at time.
No, the last thing, well, one of the things I actually two things I wanted to say is, actually for you, but for people listening, like, this personal evolution, this personal transformation, I always say that we do this interpersonally. What we want is enough commonality and enough difference between two people or two groups engaging. Enough commonality and enough difference is what allows transformation. If there's only difference, we're just going to fight. If there's only commonality, we're preaching to the choir. So that's why I think we've always vibed, is because we agree on many things and we don't agree on other things. And I think we both come away with differences or shifts within ourselves. And I think that's what human experience is about, and that to me isn't the us versus them, you're wrong, we're always just, we have a very, great, vital conversation. Last thing, I don't know, I find myself wanting to say is, again, like, I feel a lot of value and connection of what you're doing in the population that you're working with. And just so people listening, like, I even like the only reason Dr. K and I are on today is because I told him last week, I'm like, I still get so many emails and messages from people from the healthy gamer community. I'm like, it just feels great. And the thing I want to say right now is like, unfortunately, I may get more messages after this, and I
Yeah.
cannot, like, I just literally
Don't
cannot
open the
handle
door
the
to that
volume of stuff
Pandora's
I'm getting in, and I'm
box.
sorry.
Yeah.
That does not mean. And the thing is, I want to say I'm sorry, because I think it is. Don't take that as your only way out. I think if you connect to this stuff, like, just keep on your path and trying different things. I think it's really important. I don't know if Dr. K, if at some point thinking about getting more into online work and group work, if we can set something up, I'm happy to try to be there to support people in the community.
Sure.
Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to, no, I'm just saying to people, I'm not going to be able to like answer your emails, and that doesn't mean I don't read them. It doesn't mean I don't appreciate them. It's just, I'm not able to literally physically get to all the emails right
Sure.
now, but I really think this is a special community.
I really appreciate that. And I really also want to just actually highlight what you said, because it's beautifully said. I've never heard it put that way, that, what we really need to connect is a certain amount of commonality and a certain amount of difference. And there's been recently, over the last year or so in our community, this is something that we've been trying to figure out, and it's challenging, but I'm optimistic. So I think there's a lot of gender-related tension in our world today. I think there's a lot of toxicity around online dating. I think people are struggling to understand the experiences of other genders. And I just don't mean men trying to understand women and women trying to understand men. We're talking about transgender experiences, non-binary experiences. Yeah. And what I oftentimes see is that there's a lot of like hurt out there. A lot of women have an experience of being everything from straight out assaulted to taken advantage of to, led under false pretenses. And on the flip side, there are a lot of men who try to connect with women and are judged very harshly based on it's unclear. And so this is a dynamic that has actually been like coming to a head in our community. And I really, really appreciate your words about there is some shared experience. And recently I've actually been like a little bit hopeful, because people have been of various genders have been sharing their own experiences and actually connecting with people across the aisle and saying, hey, this is a part of your experience that you feel is isolated and restricted to your gender, that in my experience and my gender, I've experienced this as well, and I can actually connect to you there. And here are the ways that my experiences seem to be different from yours. And we're seeing that, so it makes me a little bit hopeful. I think there's just a lot of built up, as you kind of mentioned, psychedelics unveil everything that's subconscious. And what I'm sort of noticing in society is that there's a lot of subconscious that sometimes rises to the levels of conscious action and behavior. I don't know what we're going to do about this. I don't know that we can necessarily fix this, but one thing that I don't know if I have enough faith in this community. I wish I could say I had faith in our community that we would be able to resolve gender dynamics in the 21st century, in the year 2022. I actually don't believe that. I mean, it's a question mark for me, because I think I've just come to appreciate how challenging some of these issues of separation truly are, how much hurt there is. But I just wanted to say I really appreciate what you said about, there's some shared ground and there's going to be some difference. And being able to engage around both of those things, almost kind of leaning into Rick's approach to people, which is really trying to understand, connect, meet people where they're at. If something is going to work, that's going to be it. And I'm optimistic about that. Once again, thank you very much for everything that you do for the world. Thank you for everything that you do for this community. We all really like you. Hopefully you won't get email bombed. But I'm glad that you shared that you do have, limitations, and for people to not take things personally. I think sometimes it can really feel that way when our voice, when we're looking for support and we ask this person and this person and this person and this person, and no one gets back to us, it can feel incredibly isolating. The last thing that I just want to say, we did a medical disclaimer at the beginning, but once again, everything this is just Will and I sort of sharing our experiences. We're reviewing a docuseries on Netflix, and that, we're not, or at least I'm not, I don't know if Will disagrees with this, but, generally speaking, these substances can be dangerous. And so I certainly don't recommend that you use any of these substances without proper guidance, at least in the United States. That's medical guidance. And I'm pretty sure that that sort of applies to Will as well, but you're welcome to kind of disagree with that. And really, this is the kind of thing where
I'll leave.
Huh?
No, it's just I have a client that showed up
sure.
3 minutes ago, so I need to go see a patient. But yeah, no, I do agree with, like I said, like I'm on your platform. I agree with your stuff. It's just better for everyone that way. So,
yeah. Take care. Well, thank you very much.
Okay. All right. Bring me. Peace, everyone.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember that when Will is on this journey, I think that he too. So I think Will is part of a organization of therapists who help people process psychedelic experiences. I don't think that they administer psychedelics, but he knows how to put these things in context. And the key thing to remember, not just from a medical disclaimer standpoint, is that there is a tradition here and there are safe ways to use these substances. I personally don't know. So the advantage of the medical system is that generally speaking, it's like quite consistent, right? If I go fill a prescription at a pharmacy, I know what I'm getting. So my biggest concern with some of these traditions is that, as Will kind of mentioned, there are people who are charging $2,000 to, use magic mushrooms and they don't really know what they're doing. How do we know the difference? How do we know whether it's one of those 5 people that Will trusts, or it's someone who's just is an expert in marketing and crypto finance and now offers transformative experiences with psilocybin, right? Because that's going to happen. There are going to be people who move from affiliate marketing to crypto to the healing powers of psychedelics. And so I just don't see a consistent way. And this is where, in some of my experiences with alternative medicine, I was very open-minded. And being very open-minded, what I discovered is some stuff, it's not actually all equal. That sure, there are good cases of energy healing, but there are a lot of people who go to energy healers and don't benefit very much. That there's a big difference between, one of my mentors, Dr. Wong, published a study in the New England Journal of Medicine about the effects of Tai Chi on osteoarthritis. So this is a real clinical trial looking at the advantages of Tai Chi for arthritis. And I've never seen a study on energy healing that achieves those kinds of outcomes. And so this is not where, I think if we're sort of thinking about kind of mass education, there's a certain amount of consistency, which I think is really important. And my biggest concern about psychedelics is that we don't hear the full story, right? What we hear are individual stories, and individual stories are actually valuable. But generally speaking, I mean, even if you look at a docuseries on Netflix, even if you look at what we do, there's a selection bias. There's always a selection bias. We select for certain kinds of stories, right? So today we had Will, and we chose Will. Will chose us, and we chose to share his story and his conversation. We believe that that has value. But if you're watching this, it's very important to understand that's just one person's experience. And I think Will would agree with that, right? That's his whole point, is this is just my experience. And my experience hasn't mirrored the experience of Buddha so far. So that's where I kind of part ways with Buddhism. He's very nuanced about that. So, if y'all are curious about this stuff, I think that's fantastic. I think you should educate yourselves. And at the same time, there's a reason why we go through a scientific process. At least I believe that. And I think those scientific safeguards are very, very, very important. And this is where people may say science and big pharma and stuff like that. But I don't know if y'all get, for example, the consistency and efficacy of antibiotics, right? There is nothing in complementary and alternative medicine that I have seen that is as simply effective and reliable as antibiotics. There's a lot of good stuff out there. Meditation is fantastic. Don't get me wrong. But there's a reason why Western medicine has come to dominate the world. And I think that's because it's consistent. I'm a big believer in Eastern medicine and all that kind of stuff. But then I studied this stuff and I went to medical school, because what I realized is that a lot of these traditions of healing are not consistent. You just don't know. If I'm interested in psychedelic therapy, for example, how do I know if it's one of the 5 people that Will is like, yeah, these people are solid, or if it's just someone who hung up a shingle who has no idea what they're talking about? So please, please, please be careful. Please do not use these substances unless you're under the guidance of an appropriate person. I would recommend a medical professional because, once again, you don't know whether the spiritual healer is a good spiritual healer or a scam artist. You just don't know that. Or maybe not even a scam artist. That may be unfair. Maybe someone who has the best of intentions but lacks that experience that Will talked about, that personal journey of years and years of work and experience and helping others. So be careful, right? I know that psychedelics are all the rage and everyone's talking about microdosing and things like that. There are studies that show that microdosing is good and studies that show that microdosing is bad. This is why the work that Rick Doblin and MAPS is doing is so important, because we do need to figure out, okay, what can we actually rely on? And the big thing to be careful about is that we don't actually know yet. That's just my take, right? So you can have your own personal experience, but as a physician, what I've seen is that personal experience isn't transferable, and that's why you can't rely on it to build a plan for a population. You had this fantastic experience with psychoanalysis. That's great. It's unclear whether your experience can translate to another human being. So it's good to hear these stories. We're really grateful to Will. Really fantastic person. I'm so glad he came on. Hopefully y'all learned something useful. And, be careful, right? So use this. Don't go around. I would not recommend going around experimenting with this stuff, and use it under the guidance of an appropriate professional. And that's why I believe that. It's not just like a, cover your ass disclaimer. I genuinely am telling y'all to be careful. Because the whole point is that the documentary doesn't show the people who wind up in my office. And that stuff can be scary. It can be very scary and damaging. And in some cases, people will feel like they're permanently, in the same way that psychedelics, people will share stories of for months I haven't had symptoms. I haven't been suicidal for years after this experience. I've also seen the flip, where 3 years ago I had a bad trip, and ever since then. And Will sort of mentioned that, I don't think that person was kind of healthy from the beginning. And that's what I think is actually really dangerous about some of this stuff, is that if we say, if you're drastic at the end of your road and nothing is working for you and you're contemplating suicide, and there's this beautiful story with music and visuals and this beautiful healing experience that this person was healed through the power of psychedelics. The problem is that person who is really, really struggling, really, really, has very active and severe mental illness, it may be very helpful for that person, but those are the kinds of people that I also think may be at highest risk for the worst outcomes. And the whole point behind science is we have to be able to gauge that risk. Even with any prescription, there are going to be side effects and there's risks, right? Even medication that we prescribe has risks. The challenge with psychedelics, at least in my mind, is that we don't know exactly what those risks are, right? We don't know what to expect. We don't know what your probability of success is. And that's where there's a tension between individual experience and population health, right? Just because I didn't get vaccinated for COVID, I guess no one needs vaccines. That's incorrect, right? So if we've learned anything from medicine, it's that you can't universalize one person's experience. That's why we don't base medicine on anecdotal data. We have rigorous protocols where we try to get the closest to reality. And the good news is that I think that basically works, right? Generally speaking. We can discover, for example, how electrons work, and then we can build a lot of different devices, like the screen that I'm looking at your computer and your cell phone, and that cell phones work. They don't work based on someone's anecdotal experience. They work based on the scientific principles that we've elucidated about our world, right? Gravity is we discovered how that worked. So that's just something to really, really keep in mind. At the end of the day, I'm cautiously optimistic, but we try to be pretty careful. I mean, we teach a lot of stuff on stream that is not evidence-based, especially when it comes to spirituality and things like that. But I think it's important to recognize the difference between the two, right? It's one thing when Dr. K says, okay, here's a meditation to help you sleep. There may not be any scientific study behind that. It's just my experience. And there's a difference between my experience and what's scientifically valid. We try really hard. I'm not saying we're perfect at it. I don't know that you can be perfect at it. It's separating out the two. But I think when it comes to something as serious as psychedelics, you really have to be careful. So a couple of other things. One of the things that Will mentioned is that, he's afraid that psychedelics will be consumed by the medical model. And literally, the reason we're streaming here today is because I saw that there were some shortcomings of the medical model. What I saw was that there are more people out there than I will be able to help if I am their doctor. And so I had a thought, can I help people outside of my office? And that's why we started streaming. That's why we started HG. And a big part of that then became, can I teach people to help people the way that I do? Can this information, knowledge, and expertise to a certain degree be passed on? And as I started to explore that, I discovered, the United Nations, WHO, a lot of research about the peer support model, which is now scientifically validated, right? We've sort of discovered, and we've kind of known this for a long time, that peers can actually be helpful. We've sort of seen that tradition in things like Smart Recovery, Refuge Recovery, Alcoholics Anonymous, that people can help each other. And so that's where essentially our coaching program was born. It was recognizing that therapy is very, very valuable and can be drastic and transformative. And also, not everyone needs therapy, and not all of the problems that we face can be reduced to what therapy can fix. And so if y'all are interested in doing personal work on yourselves with a guide who has been, I've tried to share my perspective on Vedic psychology, understanding the mind, understanding how to, look at problems, how to change behavior, how to hold people accountable, then check out coaching. Y'all can sign up and start within 48 hours. So we've got spots available. Last thing that we're going to talk about is there's actually the social Ask a Coach is going on, not Social Sandbox. Ask a Coach event is actually probably started about 15 minutes ago on our Discord server. So if y'all are curious about issues of dating and relationships, y'all are welcome to hop on into the Discord. You can use !Discord to get access to the Discord. There's going to be a coach there sort of talking about it. Y'all can also get a sense of who these coaches are and whether it's valuable or not. My understanding is that the three things that people like the most in our community are the Social Sandbox, Ask a Coach on a particular topic, and the Touch Grass Challenge. So that's where, if y'all aren't quite, if you're looking for some degree of engagement and want to kind of get a taste of something, kind of like Will was saying, he had his first taste and then it's been a journey since then. So by all means, join and participate, listen, be a fly on the wall, whatever. It's a resource that's there for our community to discuss things that are important to you. Last question that we've got is who to raid. Any suggestions? Going outside is fantastic. Highly, highly recommend it. Okay, so we've got someone saying pin fun games. Let's do it. 2 viewers. Let's go, chat. 2 viewer raid. I don't know what pin H2216 is doing. But we can do that. Let's go. All right. Happy Wednesday, everyone. I hope this was educational for people. And I don't know exactly what we're doing on Friday, but hopefully it'll be fun. Take care, everybody. Oh, we're still, okay. There we go.